Wet on wet is great for large, even areas where there are no brush strokes, think skies. It is also really good for blending areas, and by that I mean things like value and colors. Think like tie-dye, for example. So that's what we're going to do first. We want to start by giving ourselves, you know, a decent size area for our first wet on wet. So this is going to be wet on wet with an even area with no brush strokes. Next, I'm going to do another wet on wet area where this is more like a blend. And just for ease, I won't make that one quite as big. Now, since we also want to deal with wet on dry, I'm going to come down here and give myself two different size boxes just because. These will both be wet on dry, but I'm going to handle those in slightly different ways. And of course, making sense that you're all set up. So I've got a tub of water over here. There is a brush already in that. I definitely have my paper towels ready to go. I got my paints. I've got a couple of colors already mixed up just because, some scrap paper, and actually a selection of brushes in addition to the one that I think I'm going to use. The size of your brush really depends on the area and what it is that you're doing. Obviously obvious to me, in a larger area, a bigger brush might actually be what the doctor asked for. You know, in a sketchbook this size, it doesn't need to be crazy large unless I wanted to fill the entire page. One of the things that we want to do first when it comes to wet on wet, in order to get an even coat, it is going to be best, and I'll start this on my scrap paper first, it's going to be best to wet the paper. It doesn't have to be soaking wet, but at least damp. Wet the paper and then put the paint or the color on that. So you need clean water, and let's test this out. I'm just going to put plain water over here. Again, not a ton. And then I'm just going to grab a little color, and you can see what I've got. It definitely dilutes it a little bit, but I can come through here and I can cover a fairly big area with even value. Now, because it's a little bit lighter, I'm gonna go ahead and add a little bit more green in here, and I'll test out my value. You know what, just because I'll add a little bit more blue as well. All right, now I need a clean brush, some clean water, and I need to work fairly quickly with this. So I will come through and it's almost impossible to see this on camera, but the paper is wet. I'm going to come through here and grab some of my paint. You can see it's dispersing. What you first saw on there, that kind of like dispersing, that tie-dye effect, is what we're going to go for next. Now, I want this to be as even as possible, but I'm barely touching the paper with like kind of the side of the brush. You don't want to overwork the paper. And the thinner the paper is, the easier it is to overwork it. But the goal here is to have no brush strokes and as even an application as possible. And I'm pretty happy with that. That's like a, you know, a fairly pale sky. Next, if I'm going to do like a blend of a couple of different things, I'm actually going to prep and have, let me get another brush here. I'm gonna have a second brush at the ready. Again, I'll need to work fairly quickly. I'm gonna do some water in here, then some really light color, and then a darker value, just so you can super easily, hopefully, fingers crossed, see it bleed together. So again, clean water to fill the space, light value so that I have some contrast. I'm less concerned that it is perfectly smooth here, but right away I'm going to grab a much darker value of paint, and you can see it start to bleed out. If I was to do this on not wet paper, it's going to have an entirely different look to it. It's interesting, and you can see how this has been transforming over time right here as well. So that's two different ways to do wet on wet. If I want to do wet on dry, I can put wet paint right on the paper, which is essentially what I did over here. But what I can also do is come through and paint an initial coat and let that dry, and then come back and paint on top of it to get a nice clean edge once that initial coat is dry. And the main thing that I want to watch out for is that value needs to be really light, like maybe even lighter than this. So I'll take some of this paint, I'm gonna put it over here, I'm gonna add a little bit of water to it. Then I am going to come through here. Again, not overworking the paper, being very gentle. I'm barely gripping the brush here just so it will be as soft a touch as possible. And for now, I just need to let that dry. Now that we're back, we have our original just plain dry paper. We have our very light value dry on the paper now, and I can tell that it's dry because when I touch it, it's not, obviously it's not wet, but it's also not cold or cool to the touch, which means that is going to be dry. And basically what we're going to do is we're just going to take a darker value than what we have in order to paint on here, because as we should know at this point, with watercolor, you have to start with your lighter values and gradually work towards your darker values. So you can't paint light on top of dark. But what I can do is come through here and just, you know, make a design. So let's see what we've got. I got some paint mixed up over here, and I could come through and, right, it could really be anything. This is a ladder. That ladder could be leaning against a wall, and there is a window looking out the wall. Looks like it's pointing out the window at this point. You know, some cracks on the wall there. We could bring another color in here. You do have to be careful because if you get two colors close together, right? If they're still wet, that is, right? If I have some of this on here and I grab a different value and I start painting next to this, whoa, look at that. And then all of a sudden, oh man, they're gonna bleed together. So you do have to plan ahead, and you do have to be careful. If I want to bring another value or another color in here, I have to be really careful not to let them touch unless or until the first coat is dry. Okay, so we've got that. That's not really what I wanted to show. What I really want to show is darker value on top of white paint. So the edges of the brush strokes are showing up super easily. They're not bleeding together like they did up here. They're not going to bleed together like they will even over here because that's still damp. I've got a slightly different color over here. Let's mix these two together, and I could come through, and really I'm just experimenting with mark making. I'm not kind of expecting anything in here. And once you have even that dry, you can come back with other value and paint even on top of this. What does that look like? You know, I don't know. I'm just playing around. Really, it's like this little tiny banana over here. I could come through and do any sort of marks on that. I could give it a little shadow to make it look like it's hovering. Whoop. A little shadow to make it look like it's hovering. But you can, as long as your paint is dry and you're coming back with a darker value, you can work on top and you can work on top. You have to be careful about bleeding together when we're just like painting like we would normally paint, because that's what wet on dry is. But we want to be able to do both. Wet on wet, wet on dry. You can put paint on paint, paint on paint, to get it to bleed together, to get it to stay completely separate. That is what we mean when we say we want wet on wet, and we want wet on dry.